Perfect. Thank you very much for having me. Really looking forward to talking to you today about a couple of projects that are very close to my heart. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm Dr. Stephen Dunn. I'm at Northumbria University. And today what I'm going to do is I'm going to hopefully talk to you about a couple of projects that we've been conducting recently, which have been looking at exploring loneliness, particularly in stroke and brain injury survivors. So as an outline of what we're going to be looking at today, I'm going to talk about loneliness, and specifically with a focus on these two key populations that I've worked with over the past 15 years or so, and those are stroke and brain injury survivors. I'm going to talk about a couple of projects that we've specifically run over the past 4 years, one of which has explored loneliness in these populations, trying to define what loneliness means to these populations prior to the pandemic. And then a second project after the pandemic, exploring whether anything had changed from what we previously had found. And my hope is not just specifically to talk about this research, but also get your ideas about what this actually means and what these findings mean in terms of moving forward, and potentially some recommendations that we can think about incorporating into future research, but also future practice based on these findings. So I guess the best place to start is at the start, and specifically, where did we start looking at this, me and my team, and why? And surprisingly, loneliness wasn't a strand of research that I was originally involved in or I was actively investigating. Originally, I was actually more focused on rehabilitation after stroke and brain injury. And this was specifically in the domain of looking at visual rehabilitation. So following a stroke specifically, there's often associated visual problems. And my research up until 2019 had mainly focused on rehabilitating this visual loss. And through this work, I've developed a free self-adjusting multi-platform reading and visual exploration training app with my team at Durham University, which allowed users to train their vision at home, the hope was that this would be able to save the NHS a bit of money because survivors were not having to utilize NHS resources. They could be training at home, and also granting them some independence and control over their rehabilitation. So after we'd done this and we created this tool in early 2019, we were interested in getting some feedback about it and understanding what kind of things we should be prioritizing in our research over the next few years. And so we ran a key stakeholder engagement event where we invited stroke and brain injury survivors. We invited healthcare professionals, carers, friends and family members of survivors to come and talk with us about our research priorities, things that matter to them, and to give us some feedback on this visual training tool. And these are just some photos from that day itself. And interestingly, on that day, one of the key issues that was raised at this event by everyone involved, all key stakeholders, was this idea of loneliness, and how loneliness was peak among brain injury and stroke survivors. And this wasn't a concept that previously we had focused on or thought about or looked at. And this kind of piqued our interest. It also made us feel foolish that we hadn't thought about this until now. This was something that all key stakeholder discussions on the day were revolving around. So we knew there was something here that we needed to explore in these populations due to its importance to everyone involved who've worked with these populations. Just before I go into how we did this, it's important, I guess, to touch on these key concepts in a bit more detail. So loneliness at the time had been increasingly identified and was starting to become more increasingly identified as a public health issue. So I find it even more strange now that it was something that we hadn't really considered looking at, especially considering the different populations that we work with. And in terms of some key figures around loneliness, the number of over 50s who experience loneliness currently is set to reach 2 million by around 2025, 2026, which was a 50% increase in 10 years, according to a study by Age UK in 2018. That study probably slightly out of date now, considering what's happened subsequently to that. And the specific populations that we work with, stroke and brain injury, those with a disability, they're considered to be at an increased risk of loneliness, of experiencing loneliness. So it would follow logically and rationally that those who've had a stroke or a brain injury are at increased risk of experiencing loneliness due to the associated issues that come as a result of a stroke or brain injury. and the disability that's associated with these issues. However, at that time, back in 2019, this relationship between things like brain injury, stroke, and loneliness was unspecified in the literature, and it really intrigued us. So it's something that we really wanted to explore. In terms of brain injury and stroke specifically, I want to focus on these populations. I'll be talking a lot about them over the course of the next sort of 45 minutes or so. And it's important to understand, I guess, the similarities and the differences between these two populations. Both stroke and brain injury are very similar. They're both neurological in nature, and they can lead to several disorders. So cognitive issues, psychological problems, and motor examples, just to name a couple. Brain injuries and stroke, however, they differ because of their etiology and the populations that are affected by them. So brain injuries are a major cause of death among children and adults who are aged under 45, whereas strokes generally appear after the age of 45 and are considered as the principal cause of the disability. Brain injuries, they're often characterized by a bleeding within the brain, which can originate from a violent impact to the cranium. And this can be an injury to the head from a blunt or a penetrating object, for example. Or it could be an injury from a rapid movement of the head, causing this back and forth movement inside of the skull, pictured in the image. With brain injury, there's two injuries that take place. So you have a primary injury, and then you have a secondary injury. And the primary injury is this irreversible cellular damage or cellular injury as a direct result of the impact itself. And then this secondary injury is the damage to the cells that weren't initially injured in this initial impact. And there is an aspect of that occurs hours or even weeks after a brain injury. Strokes are slightly different. There's three main types. So strokes are considered an acute brain attack, which results from an interruption of blood circulation, which is usually caused by either blood vessels bursting in the brain, which can lead to a hemorrhagic, what's known as a hemorrhagic stroke, or these blood vessels being obstructed, which is known as an ischemic, an ischemic stroke. There's also a third type, which you may have heard of. It's called a transient ischemic attack, which is more commonly known as a mini stroke, and is caused by a temporary disruption in the blood supply to the part of the brain. And this disruption in the blood supply results in cell apoptosis, which is cell death due to a lack of oxygen in the brain. Now, stroke specifically is considered one of the biggest threats to public health. There's more than 100,000 strokes in the UK every year, which causes around 38,000 deaths. 2/3 of stroke survivors actually leave hospital with a disability, which can lead to an estimated cost of around £25 billion a year. And these statistics specifically, they make stroke the fourth biggest killer in the UK. And it doesn't look like things are getting any better. The future doesn't look any better in terms of this outcome. From this year up until 2035, it's been estimated that the number of strokes occurring in people aged 45 and over living in the UK is expected to rise by about 123%. So it's something that's not going away. Stroke, I'm very aware we're giving a talk for CADA here in terms of aging and the aging population. Stroke is predominantly associated with older age, and this is statistically true. The likelihood of stroke increases over the age of 55. However, it is important to also note that 1 in 4 strokes can happen to younger people as well, or do happen to younger people. So we are at a point in time, I think, more recently, where stroke is starting to discriminate significantly less by age, which is important to note as well. And as I said earlier, after a stroke or a brain injury, it's not unusual for individuals to be left with impairments of varying severity, including motor and cognitive dysfunction, memory problems, aspects of verbal fluency being disrupted, a loss of functional independence, and difficulties in the ability to communicate and regulate one's emotions. And all of these can impact on an individual's self-esteem and their identity, and can in turn hinder their ability to connect socially and engage with individuals. And several studies have highlighted that brain injury is associated with a decrease in the quantity or the quality of friendships that individuals can accumulate, a decrease in their social contacts, and a decrease in their ability to make these meaningful relationships or individuals who have been asked have less meaningful relationships once they've had a brain injury. So it is a massive impact in terms of loneliness and social isolation. And the resulting loneliness and social isolation associated with these issues is a universal long-term consequence of living with these types of disorders. And even after learning to accept and adapt to the physical issues, developing and maintaining social contacts and significant relationships has still been found to be problematic. And therefore, brain injury and strokes have these long-lasting ramifications on things like well-being and on quality of life in the form of things like chronic mental health issues, such as anxiety and depression. So there's a number of associated issues with these disorders that are important to think about as well. And one thing we wanted to do, coming back to that workshop that we had in 2019, is to explore these kind of issues and understand the experiences of stroke survivors in relation to loneliness specifically. So in order to further understand the experiences of stroke survivors, we explored the specific meaning of loneliness to stroke survivors in the northeast of England. There's a couple of reasons why we chose this region. This region has a relatively higher prevalence of social deprivation than other regions of England, and social deprivation has been found to increase the risk of stroke. But also it was on our doorstep, so it's significantly easier to interview people who were close to us in proximity. And we hope that we could reveal potential causes or triggers of loneliness, which could include, not only the stroke itself, for example, and the subsequent impairments that occurred, but also other social and psychological problems, such as things like living alone, for example, social isolation, stigma, or even potentially some unexpected issues that we weren't expecting. And it was from our perspective, only by knowing these factors could they be tackled effectively and thereby reducing or alleviating loneliness. So we recruited stroke survivors via local charity groups in the area and our existing contacts with stroke survivors and stroke groups. And in order to take part, stroke survivors had to be above 18 years of age, living in the northeast of England, and having had at least one stroke in the past. And we managed to recruit 29 people, 13 females, 16 males. The age range was interesting. So we tried to get a generalized population of stroke survivors. So we had as young as 25 and as old as 81, but the mean age was 62 years old. So considered older age, but there were a couple of people who were younger as well to fall into that bracket of strokes affecting younger people. And we conducted semi-structured interviews with our participants. One thing we also wanted to look at was there are pre-existing measures of loneliness, and we wanted to look at how well these pre-existing measures of loneliness accounted for the experiences of stroke survivors. So we used two well-known measures of loneliness to look at this as well. The UK's Office for National Statistics has recommended using both a single direct question of how often do you feel lonely. The issue with this is that there's no time frame associated with this question. And we also use something called the UCLA 3-item scale, which asks participants, how often do you feel that you lack companionship? How often do you feel left out? And how often do you feel isolated from others? And in the interviews themselves, we discussed a range of topics, such as participants' experiences of stroke, their support networks. We asked about their level of daily social activity, their engagement with their wider community, and also asked them directly about loneliness and specifically how they would define the term and their experiences around loneliness, whether they've ever felt lonely, and just probe these kind of issues. And in terms of analysis, we used a thematic framework analysis to establish the themes that reflected the salient issues in stroke survivors' experiences of loneliness through the transcripts that we got. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through some of the pertinent findings from this initial study, this study that we had. I won't read the quotes on screen. I'll let you guys read them. I'll just talk around them as you're reading them. So in terms of the key findings, one of the principal findings that we found was that stroke survivors defined loneliness as being alone. So participants frequently referred to the word alone when they were asked to define loneliness, rather than describing sort of subjective states of how they felt when they were lonely. They described objective events or states being responsible for their feelings. And loneliness, it's interesting because loneliness researchers have repeatedly warned against using aloneness and loneliness interchangeably. But what was clear was that stroke survivors in this study, they couldn't help but do this. And for academic research, it's imperative to draw these clear and indisputable boundaries between concepts, even when they're tightly associated. But in contrast to this, the stroke survivors that we spoke to thought from their direct experiences. Now, being alone doesn't necessarily bring about loneliness, but despite this, it was the image of being alone that came to stroke survivors' minds when they were thinking about what loneliness meant to them, or how they would define loneliness. So it seems hard for stroke survivors to describe a mental state without referring to a related physical state. And there was also an emphasis on the length of aloneness for participants, who spoke about this being for a long period of time or for hours on end. So there's also this associated time element to this aloneness, which was important. Stroke survivors also spoke about a loss of independence as leading to loneliness. So previously we spoke about the associated issues post-stroke, and either partial loss or complete loss of cognitive or physical abilities can mean immobility, for example, difficulties in communication with others, and basically stroke survivors having to reduce the contents of their life so that their daily life can remain manageable. And if this is the case, then being alone at home seems almost an inevitability. And aloneness among stroke survivors offers this quintessential example of something called imposed aloneness, which has a much higher chance of turning aloneness from a necessary to a sufficient condition for loneliness. And it's not difficult to imagine that when being alone isn't your choice, you can almost certainly feel powerless or hopeless. And additionally, on top of this, identity aloneness was something that was prevalent in stroke survivors' responses. And that is the awareness of how different they are from who they were before. So a lot of the time we speak about this pre-stroke versus post-stroke identity. And this difference wasn't just about from who they were before, but also from those around them. Stroke survivors were especially wary of the possible undesirable labels, either they themselves or others put on them. And this is why they cared and they worried about losing their independence or taking on a new identity, for example, of the dependent or the sick one. Even if they could accept this new you, they found it a daunting task to make others understand this new you without putting a negative label to it. Stigma was a big issue in survivors' responses, and stigma specifically from stroke survivors in our study was found to prevent stroke survivors' ability to seek help. So one identified issue in stroke survivors' responses was that rather than seeking help, they would actually wait for help to be offered. And this reinforces previous findings regarding a perceived stigma being associated with poorer help-seeking attitudes. So just as an addition to the quote on screen, stroke survivors also said things like, "I worry more about what other people think than what I'm actually feeling. And I always find it awkward if I ask people for help. Within myself, I can't bring myself to ask for help." So rather than voluntarily telling others that they need help, they would wait for others to ask. So, and stroke survivors explain this in terms of the low probability of receiving genuine and sincere help. Their unique profile as individuals living with a multi-morbidity disorder, coupled with the issues identified previously, places them in this more disadvantageous position with a higher rate of identified barriers to seeking help, which further increases this likelihood for isolation and loneliness. I spoke about we use measures of loneliness, two of the most commonly used measures that are suggested by the Office for National Statistics. And one thing we found is that there may be some problems specifically around measuring loneliness in this population specifically, but I will talk about this a bit more later on as well. And for both of the measures of loneliness, the mean and the median were very similar. So it was clear that these scales were actually measuring the same thing, which is great. There was validity there. However, there were problems in that individuals did not present as lonely according to the scales, even though they would openly tell us during their interviews that they were lonely, which is problematic. It seems that these current scales that are used, they're really good at capturing potentially universal features of loneliness, but they don't relate to the specific experiences of stroke survivors, for example. And from this, we can think about potentially, a new scale, particularly for stroke survivors, should be developed potentially to help measure their experiences of loneliness more accurately, resulting in, hopefully increased detection of this issue and hopefully the ability to intervene when required. So the data presented here suggests that any new scale should probably address two key aspects, and that is identity and survivors' ability to communicate with others. So I'll take those in turn. So firstly, in terms of how the stroke survivor sees themselves since the stroke, and with companions around them and involving them, stroke survivors wouldn't feel isolated, at least in the sense of the three items of the UCLA loneliness scale, but they may still feel lonely. And to reflect their sense of loneliness more precisely, any new scale should probably contain items about how they identify themselves, this aspect of identity, specifically whether they can continue to do things that they used to do, so this pre-stroke and post-stroke self, and how much independence they have lost since the stroke, considering independence was such a massive issue for stroke survivors. And additionally, any new scale should also capture stroke survivors' communication with others. And so except for a few occasions when they can share their experiences and feelings with other stroke survivors, for example, in designated sort of peer support group situations, they are surrounded by people who haven't had a stroke, haven't had the same experiences as themselves, which sets them apart from others. And as a result, they can become sensitive to whether others understand their feelings, or at least the intention to understand their feelings. And other people's understanding carries even more weight if stroke survivors' ability to communicate, particularly their speech and language functions, have been impaired from the stroke. So it's therefore imperative for any new scale to include items that cover both the perception of understanding by others and the stroke survivors' confidence in their ability to express themselves in front of others. So that was great. That was really good. We conducted a study. The findings were really interesting and quite novel. It allowed us to build these recommendations as well. We felt we had some really interesting findings, and we built a good foundation for understanding the experiences of stroke survivors, and some good ideas specifically around what we can do next and focus on. And we had this understanding. Impairment of some physical or cognitive abilities is almost seems like an inevitable consequence of stroke, with existing care tending to prioritize the physical aspects of recovery. But what our study did was it highlighted this importance of paying more attention to the wider psychological impacts of stroke, such as loneliness, which, if left untreated and not looked at, could lead to these additional medical conditions or exacerbate the comorbid symptoms that stroke survivors experience. And although loneliness among stroke survivors shares more, common features with loneliness among other adult groups, such as, for example, the desire for understanding from people around themselves, this study specifically revealed a few more distinct findings and meanings just for stroke survivors. So particularly their desire to maintain this pre-stroke identity, their dignity and their independence, and to minimize the chance of experiencing this vicious cycle of loneliness and potentially new episodes of stroke. Those who are related to or caring for stroke survivors should have this idea of focusing on how stroke survivors see themselves and their changes in their social relationships. So we thought it was great. We're going to really build on this and take this forward and create new scales and do all these kind of things. But then, unfortunately, the world had other ideas and COVID struck just as we were coming to write this paper up, which kind of flipped the script on anything potentially we had found previously. So COVID, as we all know, the pandemic led to enforced lockdowns, social distancing, self-isolation, and quarantines as a result of the pandemic. And all of these things, and this has been found in literature coming out of the past sort of 6 months to 12 months, has resulted in a negative psychosocial impact on the general population and an exacerbation in the feelings of loneliness generally. So for those who've had a stroke or a brain injury, this has meant things like access to rehabilitation programs and peer support networking groups has required significant adaptation due to neuro rehabilitation services cancelling face-to-face appointments and community projects, clinicians being forced to shield or work from home or even being redeployed, and a switch to video calling and telephone communication where possible. So from our perspective, for a population and populations who are already at an increased risk of experiencing loneliness, and based on our previous findings, we wanted to explore the effects of lockdown measures on brain injury survivors and whether this situation has changed among this population. And it's of paramount importance. So we wanted to explore the impact of the pandemic this time, specifically in relation to brain injury survivors, and see whether anything has changed from what we saw previously. And so we did. So we wanted to look at the effect specifically of the lockdown measures on brain injury survivors and whether the situation had changed the themes that we had previously drawn out prior to the pandemic. So again, we recruited through a number of different mediums. We recruited specifically in this time through a third sector support organization who were Headway, the brain injury charity. We also used our own connections again to support groups and brain injury groups within the NHS and our social media accounts. This time, very similarly to before, participants had to be aged 18 or over, living in the UK, and have had a brain injury in the past. And this time we recruited 24 participants, 8 females. The age range, again, was very well spread, 24 to 68 years old. This time a slightly younger mean age of 48. And we interviewed participants again, just as before. The interviews were specifically conducted between January to March 2021. So prior to the pandemic restrictions being lifted in the UK. And as the interviews took place over this period of national lockdown, all the interviews took place online via Microsoft Teams, which was interesting. And actually, I feel like a separate paper could be made just about using Microsoft Teams with specific populations who potentially have a disability. And yeah, so we also gave participants questionnaires. This time we slightly changed the script on that. We looked at giving participants a resilience scale. We wanted to know how resilient they were. So we used a brief resilience scale. We again looked at these loneliness measures, and we also gave them a scale which measured their well-being over the past 2-week period. So we wanted to see whether there were any issues in relation to that. 2 really poor graphs here, I apologize, but basically most participants showed mild to severe brain injuries based on their impairments. And as you can see, there were a range of impairments among our participants. Not everyone, some people had just one impairment, other people had multi-comorbidities, sorry. So there were a range of impairments across our participants. 7 participants were also medically retired or on long-term sick leave. We analysed the interviews, again, using the same method. And this led to the development of 3 overarching themes, which describe brain injury survivors' experiences of loneliness during lockdown. And these were the experience of loneliness. So this was a theme which described survivors' specific experiences of loneliness and how they define the term. There were 3 sub-themes within this, as you can see. So that was being alone. That was loneliness being the direct result of a brain injury. And some participants actually found it really hard to define as well. This is an interesting one, a sub-theme to think about, because I'm not going to go massively into detail about this in the following slides, but it may just be the case that it wasn't hard to define. It was just that brain injury survivors didn't want to tell us about it, which is an interesting point. The second theme is loneliness during lockdown. And this theme encompasses survivors' specific experiences during the pandemic. And again, a number of different sub-themes here, which are all direct quotes from survivors. So lockdown created this level playing field for survivors. Some survivors spoke about this as being no different to their normal lives. It bought them space and time to reflect. Survivors spoke about the importance of a fellowship of like-minded people. And also the fact that technology had actually been a lifesaver during the lockdown period, due to things like video calling and WhatsApp video messaging and things like that. And then the final theme, loneliness after lockdown, focused on the apprehension and anxiety that survivors displayed about life returning to normal. And again, these sub-themes are left out and left behind, the return to normal not being an option for brain injury survivors. And also this idea of feeling outside of society. So significantly less positive, as we'll find out in a couple of slides' time. So what I'll do is I'll take each of these themes in isolation, and I'll describe some of the more pertinent sub-themes with quotes like I did previously. So let's start firstly with brain injury survivors' experiences of loneliness. And this may look slightly familiar, considering the discussion of our previous results. But again, loneliness is being alone, as stated by numerous survivors that we spoke to. So when asked to define loneliness, again, our interviewees described objective events or states being responsible for their feelings, rather than describing the subjective state of how they feel when they're lonely. And this is very similar to stroke survivors who described this pre-pandemic in this regard. Others emphasize the important role of communication and how much this plays an important role in alleviating loneliness, with several participants highlighting that conversation and regular social interaction are critical. And without the interactions with friends or family, participants highlighted that loneliness would have been an inevitable consequence. So I'm going to move on to the second theme now, just in the advent of time. So if we move into survivors' experiences during lockdown and this second theme, survivors described the pandemic as creating a level playing field. So this was quite an interesting finding and something I don't think we were expecting. I think when we went into this study, we had this idea that if loneliness is bad for populations such as stroke and brain injury survivors prior to the pandemic would potentially lead to a supercell of loneliness among these populations. Instead, we found something very different. So survivors felt that the pandemic had raised awareness of what it was like to live with a brain injury for those who hadn't had a brain injury. And they reported that the pandemic had made them feel more inclusive in the world again, and diminished these feelings of loneliness and social isolation as everyone was in the same boat, everyone was together in this issue. And survivors actually hailed the pandemic as creating an environment of increased understanding, with those who hadn't sustained a brain injury being able to experience what some survivors described as a life in lockdown. And the changes experienced after a brain injury, they require a process of acceptance and adaptation. And this process of adaptation was described as a positive learning experience, with survivors having already adapted to an adverse set of circumstances, their brain injury, and therefore this lessening the impact of having to adapt to another life-changing event, this time in the form of the pandemic. It's a really interesting finding that I don't think we were expecting when we first started. Another finding we weren't expecting. Some survivors actually described their life in lockdown as no different to normal, which I think threw us a bit when we came across these transcripts. As survivors had already experienced this process of adaptation post-injury, many survivors actually pointed out that life was business as usual throughout the pandemic. Things like social habits, freedom, and quality of life were generally described as remaining the same as before, which just highlights further the impact of having a brain injury. And rather, what survivors actually commented on was that the real changes were occurring to those without a brain injury. And participants suggested that those who hadn't had a brain injury were experiencing a period of adaptation similar to that experienced by brain injury survivors after their injury. And survivors actually believe this raised awareness of what it was like with a brain injury and led to these increased feelings of inclusion, which was a really positive experience for many of the survivors that we spoke to. Survivors also stated, again, really interestingly, that the lockdown had actually bought them a lot of space and time. And so although the pandemic may not have had a huge effect on the lives of our participants, there were some actual notable positives that the pandemic had produced. And the vast majority, surprisingly, of our interviewees actually experienced less fatigue, a reduction in societal expectations to achieve and to engage, and the world was generally a much quieter place. And this afforded most of our survivors an opportunity to reflect. And this period of reflection, as noted in the quote on screen here, it was really important in providing our respondents with an opportunity to adapt on their own terms without feeling pressured to do so by any societal or peer relationships or peer expectations, getting in the way. So again, really interesting. One of the themes that I think is less novel that emerged and is prevalent in a whole host of other projects and other publications is this importance around peer support, with survivors speaking highly of creating this fellowship of like-minded people. And the positive impact of peer support, it's been identified throughout the literature, and it provides an opportunity for individuals to self-disclose, to be accepted, and to talk to other people who've had the same sort of issues and same sort of life experiences as themselves. And survivors spoke of the importance of peer support, specifically in the context of and throughout the pandemic. The opportunity to engage with like-minded people who've had the same sort of issues is something that can't be understated. And actually, all our participants discussed how important engaging with others who've had a brain injury has been throughout the pandemic, and also applied this generally in their rehabilitation, which is a really important process. So that was the second theme. We're now moving into this third and final theme, this idea of loneliness after lockdown. And we're taking a bit of a shift now in terms of positivity to negativity. And as you can see, even from this first quote, the responses here were markedly more negative. The first sub-theme this sub-theme that I'm presenting here showed a general fear that participants had about being left out and being left behind. And when asked about the prospect of lockdown ending, participants were significantly less positive. So whilst they were acknowledged that the pandemic had created this level playing field, participants were very skeptical that this would last once restrictions were lifted. And survivors reported feelings of frustration and disappointment regarding the short-lived acceptance of their situations. So they felt that obviously awareness of a brain injury and everyone being in the same boat led to these feelings of inclusion and awareness at an all-time high. But they were extremely anxious that this would all end once restrictions were lifted and they'd be right back in the place they started. Survivors also stated that a return to normal is not an option for themselves. So participants displayed frustration and sometimes even anger about the lockdown measures lifting and society's perceived return to normality with lockdown measures being lifted, which highlighted actually their own inability to return to normal after suffering their brain injury and the feelings of loneliness that this generates. And there's one quote that I thought about putting on screen, but it was massive, and I felt for the Welsh translation. So I'll speak about it instead, and hopefully I'll be able to do it justice through my voice. But one participant used this perfect analogy, which perfectly summed up and told me exactly how they felt. And that was this analogy of catching a train. And this is I'll read this as a direct quote. So this participant said, "When you used to go and catch the train and the train's been delayed and you all stood there on the platform together, all not able to get on the train or feeling grumpy. And then the train comes along and everyone else can get on it and go off on their life journey. And you're the person who has to stay stuck on the platform. You cannot get on that train and carry on that sort of social engagement. And it does feel that the return to normal is not an option for people with a brain injury." And I guess that also then brings that psychological impact. That is the one that I probably struggle with the most, which is that brain injury doesn't get better. Now, this is a really poignant description of that inability to return to normal for those who've had a brain injury. And it perfectly describes the social aspect of being left behind, but also touches on the psychological impact of brain injury, and that specifically that brain injury survivors feel in having to adapt to this new normal after a brain injury. And this adaptation isn't something that happens immediately or is finite. It's a constant process for the survivors that we spoke to, and something that's constantly changing. And finally, many of our participants spoke about feeling outside of society, which is, again, a marked difference from the raised awareness and positivity that they felt during the pandemic, with participants being fearful of heading back into this state with society reopening. And this comes a lot of this can be said in terms of how brain injuries and stroke are viewed as a hidden disability. And you hear that quite a lot, and it's used quite a lot in the literature. So the invisibility of brain injuries is very well documented. And this is an aspect that was often repeated by our participants. The majority of our respondents didn't display any visible signs of an injury. Rather, they described cognitive or emotional consequences of their injury and as being invisible to others. And participants found this extremely difficult when engaging with family, engaging with friends, and engaging with those that they knew prior to the brain injury, citing a lack of understanding of who they now are, which contributed to this lack of connection and social engagement. And like I said, brain injury and stroke has often been referred to as an invisible disability, which was a sentiment which was corroborated among our respondents. And participants suggested that with a more visible disability, the expectations would reduce, the understanding from society and from individuals would increase, and brain injury would generally be treated with more patience and more sensitivity. Instead, participants described living with the daily pressure and expectations from society due to this undercurrent of "we look okay," with participants expressing anger and anxiety over returning to these feelings post-pandemic. And this further generates this barrier to authentic connection between brain injury survivors and society, which leaves those who've had a brain injury feeling outside of society, feeling vulnerable, and feeling like it's every man for themselves, which was a direct quote from a participant as well. So really interesting there. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack from the accounts that I've displayed there, specifically the accounts of loneliness and how lockdown has impacted brain injury survivors. But I feel like there's also a lot of positives and a lot of things that we can take forward for what this means for the future and directions we can look at going. One of the key ones to think about is this process of adaptation. I'm going to talk through a couple of these now, I think, and then hopefully people who are significantly more smarter than me can get in touch or ask me a question and help me out. But basically, one of the key things I think that we can focus on here is adaptation. And I think this is one of the more interesting findings, being that survivors we spoke to reported the unexpected, either positive experiences or experiences that were no different to normal, or no different to their normal lives during the pandemic. And brain injury has this enormous impact on an individual's life in many different domains. And rehabilitation plays this important role within the process of coming to terms with the disability. So it therefore may be the case that brain injury survivors' adaptation to life-changing circumstances after their injury made them more resilient to the changes that were created by the pandemic. And the importance of adaptation, this was evident in the apprehension and the anxiousness, which was exhibited by survivors regarding having to relive this adjustment once the pandemic was over, with this focus on feeling left behind again, and similarly to how they felt directly after their brain injury. And this concept of being left behind it isn't novel either. It's been reported previously, but with our survivors reporting this, they felt left behind in terms of being both physically and developmentally left behind by their peers after a brain injury. And our participants displayed these varying emotions from apathy to anger as they felt the awareness of their current situation among those who hadn't had a brain injury. They felt this was at an all-time high during the pandemic, but they felt that now this was dwindling as restrictions were lifted. Societal pressure is another big one. And this, again, I think was one of the most novel findings from survivors' accounts. And that was, the negative impact of the societal expectations and the responsibilities that brain injury survivors experienced prior to lockdown. There are previous studies that suggest that societal expectations can lead to identity loss and additional stress for those with a brain injury. And during lockdown, the expectations and the responsibilities that were associated with survivors' pre-identity, pre-injury self, they were removed as people were forced to lock down during the pandemic in order to avoid the spread of the virus. So without these expectations, our survivors reported increased well-being from the well-being measure that we gave them, reduced stress, and overall this better quality of life they felt they were having, which was evident in both the questionnaire data and also in the interview data. So after a brain injury, survivors report feeling left behind physically and developmentally, as I've said before, but lockdown actually provided survivors with time to reflect and a safe space to focus on themselves. And therefore, it feels like it's important to try and focus on recreating these same positive circumstances among brain injury survivors now that we're outside of the pandemic, in order to boost their resilience to loneliness and protect their mental health moving forward. How we do this is a question that I'm not smart enough to answer. And, pausing life like we did during the pandemic, or like it felt we did during the pandemic, during lockdown, isn't obviously feasible. However, one way in which we can think about trying to achieve this is potentially through reconstructing survivors' identity in society and changing their beliefs around what society does expect, or what the societal expectations are, and specifically the reduction of an individual's expectations in terms of what is perceived normality, both physically and emotionally, in terms of their development. I think that's one thing we should be focusing on. And the final thing I think that I spoke about across those studies, and I think is again, this isn't novel, but I think it's something that can be focused on, is peer support, because of its importance in terms of how how both stroke survivors and brain injury survivors spoke so highly of it throughout both the studies. And brain injury survivors and stroke survivors' unique profile as individuals who do live with a multi-morbidity disorder, coupled with the issues that we've identified in this study, places them in this more disadvantageous position as a group of individuals who have this higher rate of identified barriers to seeking help, that stigma problem, which further increases, their likelihood for isolation and subsequent loneliness. And survivors actually tended to believe that instead of seeking help, they needed to wait for help to be offered. And this exacerbated loneliness, which also, as did their tendency to actually question how genuine the help offered would be. Peer support, which is, where individuals come together who have people who share a similar problem. They come together to provide mutual help and support, to provide a space to self-disclose, provides a unique sense of community and the opportunity to be accepted and the opportunity to share information, is a ready-made way of alleviating this problem. And with the associated changes in personal identity and the stigma and help-seeking issues which have been identified by both brain injury survivors and stroke survivors, the importance of peer support groups to this population is hugely unsurprising. Granting opportunities for socializing and social network expansion through peer support provides a ready-made method of or a coping strategy, for example, for dealing with loneliness for many of the participants we interviewed. So I've spoken for far too long. One thing I wanted to talk about lastly was potentially opportunities for involvement or collaboration, if anyone was interested, or also answers to kind of some of the questions that I've posed today, or if anyone has any other views. So one thing I want to talk about lastly was these opportunities and where this is going. So I'm constantly on the lookout for, like brain injury survivors, a fellowship of like-minded individuals myself. And there's a number of avenues that we're exploring for future research. The two of the most prominent ones at the moment, I would say, are trying to develop our understanding of specifically measuring loneliness and how we can actually take into account the experiences of brain injury and stroke survivors in these other populations. And after discussions with other academics, it seems that the current scales that we use don't effectively match the experiences of those with a chronic illness. So we need to be in a position where we can develop scales that do. It's important to do so in order to understand survivor experiences. And peer support is also extremely important, as I mentioned above. And again, this isn't just for stroke and brain injury survivors. However, access to these groups can be problematic and somewhat of a lottery, and can depend upon things like charity funding, the location of the group itself, and also individuals' ability to travel. I know specifically for brain injury and stroke survivors, this issue with a lack of independence sometimes comes from removal of a driving license and an inability to travel in that way. So one thing I want to pursue in the not too distant future is making peer support as accessible as possible and available as possible for all brain injury and stroke survivors. And to do this, I'm looking at various methods. One of the most prominent ones at the moment is a technological solution based on how well brain injury and stroke survivors performed using things like Microsoft Teams and apps and mobile phones and things. So potentially through the creation of a downloadable multi-platform peer-to-peer support service, something like that for stroke survivors, but also as a way of signposting information for family, friends, and other stakeholders in terms of what constitutes stroke and what constitutes brain injury, and any important information that way. It's very early days, and I'm mainly just spitballing this out at the moment to see if anyone else has any other things that could be involved with. But this is something that I'm quite passionate about, I think, moving forward, and based on the research is something that I think would be beneficial. I'm always on the lookout for fellow collaborators and expanding my network. So if anyone would like to get in touch about anything, any ongoing projects or anything you're interested in, then please don't hesitate to get in touch. My Twitter handle is on the top left-hand side of the slide there. That's my face. And I think my email will be going into the chat, but just as a final thing, there's no way I can do this on my own. A massive thank you to my team. So Dr. Alison Lane and Professor Amanda Ellison and Dr. Qiming Yang from Durham University. Chloe Bradbury, who helped me collect a lot of the data for what I presented here today and actually helped me analyze a lot of it. And also to the Wolfson Research Institute for Health and Wellbeing, to Headway, the brain injury charity, for helping out with recruitment, and the NIHR Applied Research Collaboration, NENC, Northeast and North Cumbria. I think that's everyone. That's everything from me. So I think I'll hand it over if there's any questions or anything anyone wants to ask me anything.
I don't think there's any questions in the chat, Stephen, but I think that was such a brilliant presentation, and I don't know about anyone else, but I've absolutely loved listening to every second of that. And I think there's a lot of information and collaborations that, you know, we can potentially do with CADA, especially speaking upon, you know, the mobility issues and the issues with driving after a stroke or brain injury. Something's just come in from Jackie. It says we need to have a longer term rehab in community to allow people to adapt to their new situation with support.
I agree. Yeah, there's a lot. I come at this from two angles really as well. So as I said before, loneliness wasn't something that I initially got into through that initial workshop. And when I was working with people who had visual problems, so another strand of my research is working with stroke survivors who have visual issues. And one of the issues with that is that a lot of the rehabilitation happens on acute wards, for example, but the visual problems are missed, and you miss this rehabilitation window because obviously you can see the physical aspects of a stroke or of a brain injury, but often it's the vision that is last picked up, because people will go home from the acute wards, they'll have been done all their physical rehabilitation, and they will end up bumping into things at home because they can't see portions of their visual field. And I think it's really hard with the populations that I work with to target the specific issues, particularly like all of the issues in acute wards. And I think a lot has to be said for availability and length of term of rehab in the community. I completely agree with Jackie in terms of this adaptation period. It doesn't seem to end. It seems there is a significantly long adaptation period for brain injury and stroke, and I think the longer that there is support, the better. That's just, I guess, a logical conclusion. But yeah, I absolutely agree with Jackie's comment.
That's great. And Linda says a lack of access to internet in rural areas of Powys means a blended approach with face-to-face peer support and online options is absolutely essential. Yeah,
again, completely agree. I think so. One of obviously the solution that I spoke about for utilizing peer support was an online tool potentially. It's very early stages. I'm currently putting together a grant application to try and do some feasibility work around that. So if anyone is interested in being involved, then please let me know. But I completely agree with that comment. It's also pertinent because a lot of the brain injury and stroke survivors that I deal with, when we have conversations, it's face-to-face is still king. So having the ability to talk to someone face-to-face and make those connections face-to-face is still an extremely important aspect of rehabilitation. And I don't think that will ever change. I don't think things will actually end up being fully online. This is why I want to make a tool that can potentially be a signposter to some extent as well, provide some online support, but also with a face-to-face element involved. I'm still working out the logistics of how to do that. But I completely agree with you. Face-to-face peer support is the gold standard. It's just the lack of availability. I think COVID created a situation whereby a lot of peer support groups were unable to continue as well, which left a lot of people in the lurch. And I think, you know, we're in a position where those are slowly coming back. But I'd be interested to see the issues that have occurred because of that. So a blended approach of both face-to-face and online, I think, is the future. I don't think you can have just online. I think there would have to be some level of support from a face-to-face perspective.
And then one last comment that's come in is, I'd be interested to know about community support. If you learn anything about local and hyperlocal support groups, neighbours, etc. Did the fact that more support from people around them impact during lockdown?
Interesting. I think so. One of the things that came out from the I think that question is mainly about the pandemic side of things. So I'll focus on that second project with the brain injury survivors. Both groups really spoke about peer support and the level of support that they received. They spoke so highly, specifically the post-pandemic people, about the peer support groups, Headway, for example, these kind of charity groups. They did speak about, how influential people like neighbors were to them, and how family, I think everyone was in a situation during lockdown where they were stuck potentially with people that they live with in their own home. So a lot of people spoke about how important the relationships with their family and their friends were during that period of time. And some of them, the majority of them, actually strengthened their relationships. They spoke about how people were, this increased awareness of what it was like to live with a brain injury, this life in lockdown that brain injury survivors experienced, was actually really positive for developing the friendships and the relationships with people within a local community who were going through the same thing. But then the downside of that is, so a lot of people spoke about the importance of nature, for example, this idea of being able to go for walks and things like that. I think access to events that brain injury survivors can actually do. Whereas once society started to open up a bit more and people could go to the pub or go to the cinema, for example, those are scenarios where brain injury survivors didn't feel comfortable, and particularly if they were shielding as well. So they went from a position during lockdown where there were a lot of social activities that could be achieved, going for a walk with someone, having those conversations in nature one-to-one. Whereas as soon as the restrictions started to lift, the situation changed dramatically for them again, and they were again isolated and left alone, this idea of left out and left behind. So there was a really positive community spirit during lockdown, everyone being in the same boat, this level playing field. But once the restrictions lifted, survivors felt that was going, and they were fearful that would be gone. I hope I've answered your question.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Stephen. So I think we will round it up there, and a huge thank you to everyone for joining us today. We will be sending out a follow-up email, as we always do, with the details of where you can find the recorded session, and also our feedback form. So if you could fill them out, they would be amazing. And a huge thank you to you, Stephen, for joining us today. It's been fantastic. And thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for your questions.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye.